Thank you all for joining us. I wish to welcome you all to today's event, which is a talk by Bojana Videkanic, which is based on her recent book, Nonaligned Modernism, Socialist Postcolonial Aesthetic in Yugoslavia from 1945 to 1985. At the center of the book is the specificity and in a number of ways the uniqueness of the Yugoslav socialist project, its particular forms of politics, culture, and art, all developed from the foundation laid down during the Second World War by the Yugoslav Revolution, the partisan movement, and the anti-fascist fight. What Videkanic explores in the book is the important role Yugoslavia played in the creation of a particular kind of global modernist ethos and of an international post-colonial culture by focusing on the political orientation and aims of art that was produced not simply as an expression of, but as a means of articulating in the first place an emancipatory vision resistant to the ideologies of the Eastern and the Western Bloc alike. A political vision that placed Yugoslavia among the founders and the leaders of the non-aligned movement. Drawing on archival materials and developing really an interdisciplinary methodology that brings together post-colonial theory and East European socialist studies, Videkanic thus chronicles the emergence of late modernist artistic practices in Yugoslavia from the end of the Second World War to the mid-1980s. She situates these practices, these instances of non-aligned modernism, in relation to the post-colonial artistic movements of the 20th century, and shows how Yugoslav cultural workers collaborated with others from the global south to create alternative artistic and cultural networks that countered Western hegemony. Bojana Videkanic is an associate professor of contemporary art and visual culture in the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Waterloo. While much of her research focuses on the 20th century socialist art in Yugoslavia and the country's participation in the non-aligned movement and various decolonial cultural practices, Videkanic also writes about contemporary art and artists, whether from the Yugoslav region, Tanja Ostojic, for example, or from Canada, Lori Blondeau, Kinga Araya, Vesna Perunovic, and others. Bojana's new research project deals with such forms of politically engaged 20th century Yugoslav art as partisan art and naive art, and their relationship to similar art practices in Mexico, Egypt, Nigeria, and other parts of the world. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bojana Videkanic, who will now take over. I'm sorry, before you start, just a protocolary note. I'm gonna get off the screen now. You have the floor. After your talk and presentation, I will come back and we will have, as is customary, Q&A session with the audience. Audience, please feel free to pose your questions in chat, and I will try to attend to as many of these questions as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavle. I would like to thank Pavle to you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. I would like to thank Jovan Alazic-Knežević, who is also a co-host, and I'm very thankful that I have met you, as well as Michael Brager, who's been organizing behind the stage all of the administrative and other things. So it is my really great pleasure to be here. I'm gonna just share my screen with everybody. And hopefully everyone can see. Pavle, can you just confirm that you can see the presentation? Okay, awesome, thank you. So I'm going to start by just very briefly introducing what non-aligned, sort of some of the basic ideas around non-aligned modernism and what I mean by that. And I'm going to go into certain political and historical contexts, and I'll show basically some of the work that I have been dealing with in the book. So I'm going to feature a few examples of what I talk about in the book. So non-aligned modernism was conceived as a kind of a challenge to the idea of Western art, and to the idea that Western art represented the epicenter of modernism. And it does so by uncovering a system of what I call transnational solidarities or global solidarities that were established by various artists, intellectuals, art workers, managers of the second and third worlds. And more specifically, I look at the exceptional role that cultural diplomacy and artistic diplomacy within socialist Yugoslavia and elsewhere played in this process. And I do so by examining Yugoslavia's championing of various forms of modernist art through exhibitions and other exchanges. So in doing this, the project situates Yugoslav modernism within this global modernist ethos from which it has been taken out. So the study intervenes and sheds light into an underrepresented and under-researched history of modernism and modernist art, and on intellectual and theoretical connections and cultural collaborations between Yugoslavia and countries of Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America. So this rich history of international cultural diplomacy of the mid and late 20th century, and now I'm sort of going back in the early 20th century as well, decenters the dominant position in which Western art and cultural diplomacy has been canonically entered into, and establishes a new narrative and understanding of artistic and cultural work of the countries that are often perceived in this Western canon as existing on the peripheries. And this has been a process within art history for some time now, but unlike for other countries that were from different continents, in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia, Eastern Europe hasn't been seen in this perspective, and especially not Yugoslavia. So both in Yugoslavia, there was for several decades a kind of a criticism and rejection of particular forms of art. This has come out after 1990s, after the breakup of Yugoslavia as a country. And a lot of the art forms that I'm looking at were seen since the 1990s as sort of very crude propagandistic forms of art. And I try to, in my work, see them from a different point of view, which is more politically engaged and engaged with this dialogue with global modernisms. These criticisms of especially socialist realist art in early 1940s after the war in Yugoslavia have been around since the 1970s. It was really in the after 1990s that we see them emerge more forcefully and extricate this history from Yugoslav art historical writing. So the book, therefore, kind of intervenes into that and brings to the fore that has been taken out since the 90s. The other thing is that it challenges, as I said already, histories of global art that were dominated by these canonical discourses, how modernism developed, what it did. And so it challenges this idea that Yugoslav art and art of other nations similar to Yugoslavia were subservient to Western hegemony and its modernism. What it does, it gives more agency to this kind of art and those artists who made it. And in doing so, I pay attention to what famous Croatian writer Miroslav Krleža called for Yugoslav autochthon or local artistic tradition. And I link that Yugoslav particular tradition to other similar ones in non-Western world, and especially through Yugoslavia's participation in non-aligned movement to those countries in the movement. The book also stems from a very particular personal perspective. And that personal perspective was structured by a series of ruptures. So while in my work, I try to talk about continuities of thinking and being, in my own sort of personal history, I am sort of dissected through these ruptures. Of course, first and foremost is the end of my country, Socialist Yugoslavia, and then its disassembly by nationalists and fascist forces purporting to hold Western ideals, and then after that, by an onslaught of neoliberal structures that during the economic, political, and social transition, so-called transition in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, sought to integrate these now dispossessed, defeated small states into the narrative of European and global neoliberal order. So these ruptures frame how I read and see the space of art in former Yugoslavia, and also are related to the kind of material and discursive ideas that I try to bring forward. And also what I'm trying to do is to enact a kind of a political agency as well through that, and think about how can art be used, and this history be used for the future. So the methodology that I use in the book is situated in several important trajectories. One is a materialist and absolutely unapologetically so Marxist approach to understanding and theorizing both the Yugoslavia in 20th century and now. This includes discussing Yugoslav autochthon or local approach to Marxism, as well as approach to traditions in art and culture, understanding the history of World War II and anti-fascism from a perspective of revolutionary politics that was tripartite. It was a struggle against fascist Nazi occupation, it was a class struggle, and anti-colonial struggle for independence. So the second methodological framework is the postcolonial methodological framework with respect especially to how and why Yugoslavia entered non-aligned, but also to some other post-World War II politics and cultural struggles. My argument is that Yugoslavia's divergence from post-World War II Soviet Union, its expulsion from Comintern or Cominform, was not the only reason why Yugoslavia opened up to the non-aligned. What I see in my own thinking is a much longer trajectory of struggle for independence, class struggle that goes back into the 19th century. And this is where I also see how Yugoslav art history is situated and how I situated within the post-colonial and class perspective. This in particular relates to my research work that I'm now embarking on, which is connecting more World War II struggle, partisan art, naive or outsider art, socialist realist art, and so forth. And the third methodological take is the belief that these theoretical trajectories inevitably take us to the moment of the now, and how the history may allow us to create moments of solidarity for the now, and what can we do. So it's always with a kind of agency and interest in what this history can bring for us. So let me just, and just to reiterate in this slide, one of the artists is Antun Augustincic, and we'll see this monument again. This is a monument that he completed in 1955 for the victims of fascism in Addis Ababa. And Franja Mraz, who was a self-taught partisan artist who was also a member of the Communist Party, partisan resistance, and this is one of his post-World War II woodcuts. So they're kind of the works, visual representations, if you will, of the kind of work that I'm interested in and that I'm uncovering in my research. So the art that I'm talking about has to be seen in these three important points. Number one, Yugoslavia's socialism. It cannot be divorced from that. Number two, World War II and partisan anti-fascist struggle. And number three is Yugoslavia's colonial and class histories. So these are all important for how I'm reading Yugoslav modernism, non-aligned modernism. And in terms of its artistic aesthetic and broader cultural meaning, non-aligned modernism existed in tension with and in between sort of canonical modernism found in the West and local artistic and cultural traditions, institutions, and artistic infrastructure. And I keep coming back in my book to artistic infrastructure, meaning the material basis and how it was organized in order to support artistic work. And so that's important to think about. So one of the things that I want to say is that in my introduction, I talk about this, challenging modernism. This slide here shows the work by Joaquin Torres Garcia, who was an Uruguayan artist in the early 20th century, who lived for a while in Paris. And in 1943, he came back during World War II, he came back to his native Uruguay. And when he was there, he completed this really interesting map. Or this drawing, if you will, of a map of inverted map of America, in which he places what is normally seen on the south at the bottom at the top, and he places Uruguay at this X point on the map, and he frames, therefore, the entire work that he does as an artist in this geographical positionality, which is inverting the geopolitical order of the time. And so I found that this really interesting work resonated with what artists in Yugoslavia were also attempting to do both before World War II and after in their work on the non-aligned. So this is on the right is the work by Croatian artist Vilim Svečnjak, which is called Circus Europe or Circus Europa, which was a small series of ink on paper drawings that he completed in 1937 after he has read Miroslav Krleža's Balade Petrice Kerempuha, which was an important work, political work at the time, that was talking about the situation in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia, in relationship to class, colonial imperial powers, and so forth. And so his work, this particular work, is inversion of where and how we perceive Europe as a kind of a civilized place. Here, this very old decrepit man sitting in front of a nude woman in the background is a representation of the Europe, and in very different terms than the kind of civilization that we perceive it, or that has been perceived. So both artists, thinking in some 6 years difference, are inverting or attempting to invert the idea of where center and where the periphery is. And this is exactly what we encounter as the kind of beginnings of non-aligned modernism. So why am I talking about this? Although in book I don't talk about this as much, but what I try to do is I try to extricate this unidimensional way of looking at Yugoslavia and its adherence and its founding of non-aligned as strictly in Cold War terms, meaning that normally Yugoslavia is seen as a country that has started the non-aligned movement only because it was kicked out of the Cominform, and it was a kind of a pragmatic way for Yugoslavia to survive after World War II, where there might have been some of those ideas for sure. The reason why Yugoslavia went the third way, the non-aligned way, was much deeper, and that's what I'm trying to argue here. There's a longer history, both in politics, but also in art. And I find that history, of course, in the work of Miroslav Krleža, who is one of the most important writers, Yugoslav modernist writers of the 20th century, and certainly someone who has shaped the way that both pre-World War II and post-World War II art and modernism was seen. And in 1952, in one of his speeches, he rejects and critiques modernism, in fact, and he talks about how Kandinsky, who is often seen as the father of modernism, was already pointless, he says, from the perspective of Balkan wars. So when Krleža argues for a kind of autochthon modernism in Yugoslavia, he's continuously bringing us back to the conditions, the historical class and other material conditions that existed in Yugoslavia. And artists such as Vilim Svečnjak, Franjo Mraz here, as well, were under understanding this, and their work reflected these ideas. And so non-aligned modernism, while it fully develops after World War II, the people who started it, who were building its infrastructure, were already thinking these ideas before World War II, and were creating work that reflected it. The work by Franjo Mraz, Peasant Poet, was drawn in 1940, just before he left to go into partisan war, because he participated, and it was a portrait of his good friend Mihovili Pavlik Mishkina, who was a peasant poet, basically. And they were friends working together at the time. I'm not going to go into this, but this sort of further, both works by Miroslav Krleža, both early work, Hrvatski Borg Mars from 1922, as well as Balada Petice Kerempuha, is telling us that Yugoslavian artists were already thinking about colonial imperial relationships as much as they were thinking about class relationships. And these works, all of these works by Krleža, were extremely important for visual artists and were influential for how they saw themselves. And so artists who before World War II are creating class works that involve very particular dealing with class, criticism of class, capitalism, exploitation, and the life of peasant and worker class were Krsto Hegedušić, Ivan Generalić, who in these paintings depict the destruction of the rural villages that were under threat economically because of the Great Depression. And they have created a number of works, a series of works that were dealing with these questions. Others in other parts of Yugoslavia, people like Vojin Dimitrijević and Mica Todorović, both Bosnian artists who were living in Sarajevo at the time, were both thinking about this. And Dimitrijević painted this extremely brutal representation of the Spanish War from 1937. And Mica Todorović, in her work Philistines, is representing the class, the bourgeois class in Bosnia, who were exploiting people who were living there at the time. So this continues in World War II, and this is these longer sort of trajectories of non-aligned, and that's where I'm really situating all this work. So a lot of the artists who were very active politically before World War II actually entered the fighting. In fact, there were some around 650 to 680 registered fine artists, professional artists in Yugoslavia before World War II, in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Out of those, 280 were actually in active combat. So they left where they were and went into active combat, and more were in concentration camps and other prisons as prisoners of war, or as prisoners. Some of them Jewish, and were killed. So the artists actually participated in active combat, but also created work. And so these kinds of works by Marian de Toni depict the kind of gruesomeness of the war. So some of these works are seen as socialist realism propagandist, but I read them as politically engaged. I read them as work that is actually about the fight for freedom and what I call colonial liberation. And this is also the reason why it was easier for post-World War II Yugoslavia to actually establish the links to the non-aligned, because there were some shared histories, not the same histories, but shared experiences and histories that they could rely on and connect with those who were outside of the West. This is just another example by artists, both Branko Šotra, Zlatko Prica, and Ivan Goran Kovačić. All three of them were in active combat. Ivan Goran Kovačić unfortunately was brutally killed by the Ustaše. And this is his famous poem, a very disturbing poem called Yama, that was illustrated by artist Zlatko Prica. So this longer term kind of aesthetic and artistic discussion is continued after World War II. And artists who are involved with the combat are now becoming those who are building the state. So Yugoslavia post World War II and post 1948, starts building its third way and non-aligned way. Here we see some of the iconic images of President Tito with Nehru, Nkrumah, Nasser, and Sukarno. This is just as they were meeting and preparing for the 1961 first summit of the non-aligned. The historian of the non-aligned, Vijay Prashad, in his book Darker Nations, very tellingly says that Briuni, which was the island where Tito, Nasser, and Nehru met and in 1956 and sort of came up with this idea of the non-aligned, was the third world Yalta. And I think this is very important because unlike in the actual Yalta, where the spheres of influence were divided, here the decision was to kind of collaborate. And this is where I situate also the collaborations of the artists who I talk about in the book. And from the same book, Darker Nations, the quote from the bottom is that the third world was not a place, it was a project. And throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, as I trace the work of the artists, I continually come back to all of the different initiatives, all of the different projects that were built to counter Western hegemony, either in art or in media or in politics, and how these countries were negotiating this. This is the famous picture from the first summit of the non-aligned from 1961 and taken in Belgrade. And these are some images from this year, 1960, 1961. When the summit began, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. And so the summit was actually, in many ways, done in the shadow of his assassination. They began the summit by giving him a moment of silence in recognition of what happened. But at the same time, there were numerous protests in Yugoslavia in which people have come out on the streets to protest colonialism. And here we see protests in Belgrade, Ljubljana, there were some in Sarajevo, and the students that you're seeing who are at the front lines of the protests, some of whom are Black, are actually the students who would have been there because of their non-aligned cultural connections, and they would have been there to study in Yugoslavia under the non-aligned exchange programs. So these are just some of the images that I'm interested in because they form the kind of larger visual culture of the non-aligned as well, and are influential because they were in the kind of public consciousness of Yugoslavia throughout the 20th century. So what does the book attempt to do? The book examines the emergence and development of non-aligned modernism through its varied artistic and cultural trajectories, how they arose from post-World War II period, how they developed in the next 4 decades. And in revisiting these histories of exhibitions, aesthetic debates, cultural infrastructure, and networks that appeared in this period, both locally and internationally, the book defines non-aligned modernism as a synthesis of influences from local Yugoslav artistic traditions, nascent aesthetic traditions and networks of the global South or other places of in the world, and already existing Western modernist structures. So I'm not negating Western modernism, but what I'm saying is that these forms were much more hybrid and less influenced by solely Western modernism and more fluid. Artists, curators, and administrators who feature in the book moved with ease between modernism, international modernism, and its local forms and artistic forms. They readily appropriated various technical innovations, conceptual frameworks, procedures, and artistic sensibilities found in international modernism, while at the same time adapting these modernist features to their local and social needs. The resulting artistic and cultural practices were varied in formal and thematic approaches, strategies, and demands, but they shared a commitment to socialism, anti-imperialism, and peaceful coexistence. And this analysis, therefore, is done through particular examples. So I look at exhibitions mostly. I look at the first exhibition of the Yugoslav Union of Fine Artists from 1949. I look at examples of cultural exchanges, Yugoslav participation in Venice Biennale, and Ljubljana Biennale. So all of these are representative of mainstream art, of state-sponsored art. They illustrate cultural policies and practices at the highest official level, but they also speak in the ways in which modernism in Yugoslavia oscillated between various structures, institutions, political and aesthetic ideas, and historical discourses, as different stakeholders, meaning artistic stakeholders, participants, attempted to develop Yugoslavia's unique cultural language, which was a mixture of both utopian idealism and negotiated between aesthetics and politics. So I make two interventions. I've already alluded to them. One is art historical, which basically makes a claim to Yugoslav non-aligned modernism's right place in international art historical discourse. I add this case to already existing such discourses about other parts of the world. It also provides a kind of contribution to the expansion and realignment of modernist art within Yugoslav art history, which in its earlier iterations understood modernism's political and ideological context as an impediment rather than a strength, and particularly this kind of work from the early early post World War II and post World War II period. And it's in its particular entanglement with art history, I reveal key links between national and international politics, the developments of that politics, and cultural and artistic trajectories that all shaped this era. And the second intervention that I make is a broader cultural intervention that I try to do through a kind of an interdisciplinary approach to the book, in which I try to highlight the active role that Yugoslav culture played in countering political and cultural hegemony of the West. So this active participation in lively international anti-colonial socialist movements and debates, Yugoslavia made a real contribution to the building of transnational socialism, alternative socio-economic networks, and so forth. And it contributed in order to address these ideas, the narrative of the book is always interdisciplinary, because I cannot only rely on art history, but I kind of move between voices of artists, politicians, intellectuals, critics, and historians. And so the concept of non-aligned modernism represents a form of art that grew outside of the so-called developed Western world in the wake of World War II and in the context of anti-colonial socialist politics. And what's really key is to keep coming back to this idea of materiality and Marxist critique of all of these ideas. So while non-aligned modernism accepted elements of Western modernist ethos, not only because of its convenience, but also because of its prevalence and hegemony, this ethos permeated all structures of international art. On the other hand, this permeation was also rejected. And in the book, I mention and use Edouard Glissant's notion of force poetic, which he qualified as a way for those who were using the language of the colonizer in order to subvert it. In other words, the local populations subversively defied and deconstructed the language that has been imposed upon them. And this is very important for me. So that's why non-aligned modernism borrows from Western ideas of modernism in the manner of glissant, and is used, and it did because it was forced to do so by the infrastructure of international work, international art world. And this is why I keep coming back to money, investment in infrastructure and material reading, because we cannot understand modernism without understanding who holds the keys to international exhibitions, who pays for these, and what is done. So just to give you a few sort of samples of what I talk about. So the book is chronological and thematic. And I start with the first exhibition of the, as I said, of the Yugoslav Union of Fine Artists, in which I dispute this idea that Yugoslav socialist realism, form of socialist realism, was somehow totalitarian, because this is how it was read. And I show through the analysis of the artwork, and not just the artwork, but most importantly, to the debates around the artwork and the way that the exhibition was organized, that in fact, many different forms of representation, of engagement with ideas around socialism were present in that exhibition. So I focus mostly on two most important works of the era, Boža Ilić's Sondiranje terena na Novom Beogradu, which was done in 1948. And the second work was by George Andreevich Kuhn. And the argument that I make is that within this extremely hybrid form of realism that is political in nature and has a very expressive quality, we can already see how the Yugoslav artists will move towards more hybrid, what I call non-aligned aesthetic, which is very open, it's very inclusive, and has these sort of representational forms as much as it has, very kind of abstract forms as well. The second chapter of the book is dedicated to negotiation of what other art historians have already discussed in previously, which is this idea of socialist modernism. This is not a new term. Many have talked about it. Unlike those art historians, I read it as a brief period in the 1950s, especially, where Yugoslav artists were and those who were curators and organizing exhibitions were trying to negotiate how to represent Yugoslavia in the international art world. And Venice Biennale is one of the key exhibitions that happens at the time, that we can see this negotiation of where Yugoslavia fits aesthetically. And again, what I encounter is heterogeneity. It's a kind of inclusiveness. And over and over again, Yugoslav curators, policymakers who are working within the Ministry of Culture, who are working on internationalization of Yugoslav art, are all very aware of the perceptions of Yugoslavia, both as socialist, but also as a backwater. And in fact, the word backwater is used often. And so on the one hand, I look at Venice Biennale and the way that and how Yugoslavia represented itself at Venice Biennale. And on the other hand, I also look at how Western modernism was perceived in Yugoslavia. And I look at 1956 exhibition that was touring Europe at the time from Museum of Modern Art. This, as I was shocked, this was the most visited exhibition on the tour. So the Yugoslavia was the last leg of the tour, and the exhibition was in France, it was in UK, and was traveling around Europe and ended in Yugoslavia. And of all the numbers, the Yugoslav visitors were the largest. So very interesting kind of ideas around layering of negotiation of what the audience is, everyday people, public figures, how they all seeing this modernism, socialist modernism. And I just show some of the range of works that were exhibited at Venice Biennale, going from Peja Milosavljević's 1951 kind of very expressive work to Miodrag Protić's very abstract work that was actually received an award at Venice. So I moved from this negotiation in chapter 2 to a kind of what it meant, what it physically meant to have non-aligned modernism. So I talk about start the chapter by talking about this particular sculpture that was commissioned as a gift from Yugoslav people to Ethiopia when Haile Selassie was in when he was in Yugoslavia. Tito and him met and realized that there was a lot of intersecting political and other ideas, especially around Italian occupation. Both countries were occupied by the Italians. There were killings by Italians in both countries. And so Tito goes to his friend, Anton Augustincic, and asks him to travel to Ethiopia and create a kind of a gift to Ethiopians. And indeed, him and Frane Kršinić go to Ethiopia. They live there for a while and create this monument, which was kind of created in Yugoslavia, in Croatia, in Augustincic's atelier, but also partially built by Ethiopian building company when it was brought into Addis Ababa. The stone that you see at the obelisk is actually from the island of Brač, the famous marble, Brač marble. So it was brought in, shipped, and the relief that Augustincic builds is very particularly around Ethiopian history and around colonization by the fascist Italians and the destruction and suffering of the Ethiopians who were killed during that. So very similarly, he depicts Ethiopians to, for example, the way that he depicted Yugoslav partisans and civilians who were killed during World War II. He's considered to be a socialist realist. I do not consider him socialist realist. And so I read this work as a kind of a political engagement, which he was throughout his life. This is from the opening, from the ceremony of in 1956. In that chapter, I also discuss Tito's travels throughout the non-aligned countries. I also and the kind of emphasis on culture and art. So there's images of Jovanka Broz and Tito at different cultural events, which was very important and emphasized. I talk about Yugoslavia investment in the Nubian Monuments campaign during that enormous project that took several decades. And all of the non-aligned members were helping Egypt and Sudan at the time to save these cultural monuments. So Yugoslavia participated both with experts and also with money. And then I talk about 1961, the building of the Park of Friendship for the architectural solution for the Park of Friendship, which was created for the Non-Aligned Summit. Unfortunately, now it's falling apart. And unfortunately, what you see in the back, that terrible sculpture that everyone thinks it's part of the Non-Aligned, it's not. The one in the back that sort of like has this fire at the top. It is a recent addition, has nothing to do with Non-Aligned. And this is just examples of numerous visits, both of Tito and Jovanka to other countries, but also others coming in. So this is the First Lady of Liberia, Antoinette Tubman, visiting the National Museum. And then on the other image, you see Jovanka Broz in a museum in Mongolia. So this was one of the key elements to all of the visits is the cultural and artistic exchange and visiting and supporting cultures of other nations. So this is in Bangladesh, and actually one of my really dear colleagues who works on South Asia recognized the work of the artist, and her name is Sanjukta Sundarsan, and she wrote a really great book called Partisan Aesthetics about Indian partisan or politically engaged art, and she works on the artist whose work Jovanka Broz is looking at on the floor. I also talk about, different sort of architectural examples, exhibitions. So this was an exhibition that was organized in June 1975 in Algiers. And it was very particularly the exhibition of partisan work, Yugoslav partisan artists or artists who were working on partisan themes. Of course, this was politically important because Algeria was one of the key collaborators, and Yugoslavia, of course, supported the Algerian war independence in many different ways, including culturally. And there were, of course, political relationships between Yugoslav partisan struggle and Algerian struggle for independence. So it is not for nothing that it was partisan work and art that was brought in. These are some of the examples of both older generation of artists, such as Marian de Toni, and younger generation of artists, such as Franz Mihalic. And then, of course, George Andreevich Kuhn, who was one of the key older generation artists. And this is his work was also represented at that exhibition. And the final chapter is dedicated to one exhibition or biennale. So I kind of analyze it throughout the years of its existence. I look at its inception in 1955. And even though the exhibition, the biennale, was not conceived as a non-aligned event, it became so over the years. It became a kind of a very particularly an exhibition of all the world. And in fact, even though it wasn't mentioned as a non-aligned event, even in the first iteration of it in 1955, Zoran Kržišnik, who was one of the organizers, writes that what they intended to do is to meet the West and East and all the world, so that Ljubljana becomes a bridge, a meeting point, if you will, for the world's artists. And so I look at different aspects of the Biennale, but most particularly, I look at representation of non-aligned members and non-Western artists. So I talk a little bit about the way that they chose artists, how they curated, what kind of expectations were there, what kind of arts. Of course, there was, Western artists who had a lot of exposure, but there was a lot of artists from all over the world who were coming to the event. So of the artists who I sort of highlight a little bit more in the work are people like Menhad Allahelmi, who was an Egyptian artist, a very young Egyptian artist at the time, who actually her work was shown at the Biennale 4 times. She won 2 awards. And she was this young female artist who did not have the same clout in the international art world like others, but it's very important to have that kind of representation. And I highlight her work in order to give her more visibility, and the way that Biennale allowed young and upcoming artists to participate in these things. Rufino Tomaio is another example, who's at the time was very famous abstract artist, not just in Mexico, where he's from, but internationally. But again, he's an indigenous Mexican artist, and he was sort of dealing with his indigeneity in the work, and he was well represented at the Biennale. And then people like Elizabeth Cutlet, who was Mexican-American artist, feminist, a woman who was member of the Mexican and American Communist Party, who was very involved with representations of female solidarity and race in most of her work. So all of these artists, these kind of very varied artists of varied approaches, were exhibited and showcased at this Biennale. And finally, to stay true to my material exploration of this, I did kind of a little bit of a data analysis to showcase the difference between different biennales at the time. So for example, I gathered information about artists who were at these different biennales that started around the same time. So Ljubljana Biennale and Documenta Biennale and Alexandria Biennale in Egypt all started at the same time in 1955. Sao Paulo in Brazil started in 1951. So I was really interested to see the representation of artists. So I went into catalogs and I counted non-Western Western artists. So what you see in front of you in orange are the Western artists who were represented in 1955 in Documenta Biennale, Ljubljana Biennale, Alexandria Biennale, and Sao Paulo in 1951. And in blue, you see the non-Western artists. When we moved to 1964, we see that Documenta had 1% in 1955 of non-Western artists. Ljubljana Biennale had 35%. Already in 1961, during the first summit of the non-aligned, that number climbs to 42. Documenta is still around 4%. And in 1977, Documenta is around 5%, but both Sao Paulo and Ljubljana are at over 70% representation by non-Western artists. And this is an important point. Because we might say that, and there are certain criticisms that I've heard about my own work and others, is that Yugoslavia was, not investing enough. But these kind of numbers, once we start digging into the material and infrastructural questions, become very, very important and tell a different picture. So just to highlight or to summarize, because I'm done right now, number one, to conclude, number one, Yugoslav artists, cultural workers, and workers in general who were involved with World War II debates around socially engaged art, socialist realism, who were involved with World War II fighting, were key to how the country would move beyond the kind of Cold War binarism. Their attitude and work was always anti-imperialist, socialist, and anti-colonial, and it was driven by the need to find a Yugoslavian own local way, left way, both in politics and in art. What was seen as socialist realism during the war, after the war, and sort of political art was really where we see the progressive work and thinking around outside of the West. So what was rejected in the 1990s and even in the 70s by some on the Yugoslav art scene is where we see the most potent links between Yugoslavia and the rest of the world in aesthetic and cultural way. These cultural workers were involved in all of these debates. Yugoslavia's participation in founding of the non-aligned, its continuous work to opening up to the world, networking, was a direct result of the previous historical developments, including, of course, the fact that all the people who were leading Yugoslav post-World War II art were involved in pre-World War II debates on art, were actively fighting and were anti-fascist socialists during the war against Nazism, and were responsible for the formation and articulation of the non-aligned politics. And finally, artists in Yugoslavia is what I'm trying to bring up, were actually state builders. So a parallel to this is someone like Senghor in Senegal was both the artist and a state builder. And here in Yugoslavia, we see very similarly the same thing. So artists and cultural workers who I talk about in this paper, in this presentation and elsewhere, their artistic and intellectual production is directly connected to the kind of parallel politics that we see elsewhere. And I will stop my presentation and make a conclusion there.
Thank you, Bojana, very much for a very, very interesting talk. I will have some questions along the way, maybe, but for two reasons, I will not ask them at first. One is that we don't have too much time left, and I would like to see if anybody in the audience would like to ask. And the second is that there is major construction happening literally 10 feet away from me. So I don't know what I have to say, how long I will be able to speak without severe interruption. So let's see. There's one question already. I would like to explore a little bit more the materiality of these artistic exchanges. The member of the audience says, which I agree is a key. Who is paying for these exhibitions and artists? Are those predominantly state-funded projects? In other words, are these quote-unquote state visions of non-aligned solidarity? Or were artists able to carve out their own autonomous spaces? And if so, how, in what ways specifically? You began to address this, or you actually addressed it towards the very end of your talk, but maybe you would like to elaborate.
Yeah, so they were they were mostly state sponsored. However, Yugoslavian state was very complex state, and so between all of the republics and all of the Republican budgets, right? And each republic had their own republic budget for culture. Between all of the institutions, there was a lot of leeway. So artists absolutely had their own ways of making work and making do with whatever they were given. For example, Zoran Kržišnik managed to organize the first Ljubljana Biennale without any federal support. So it all came from local and Republic of Slovenia support. And only later he received actual federal state support. So what we see is a heterogeneity of approaches to states. Yes, money came from the state, but within that, there was a lot of different kinds of approaches. And what I make a point in the book is that even the non-official, you know, I don't like this word non-official because everything, even art that was sort of seen as outside of the official was actually was not that, because it was state sponsored, because state invested huge amounts of money into art institutions. And you know, Pavle can talk about film. I'm talking about art in particular. So artists absolutely benefited. A lot of them, for example, went on personal exchanges. So someone like Petar Lubarda went on an exchange, on a residency to India, sponsored through the state, and created a whole series of works related to that. And so there was a lot of negotiation, but yes, the support was from the state, but the artists had a lot of leeway, as did the Republican, the particular organizations and ministries of the republics, so, and institutions.
Thank you, Bojana. Here's another interesting question. First, I thank you for a fabulous and fascinating presentation, and wonder how you would respond to work that frames cultural translations of Yugoslav non-alignment in less affirmative terms. I'm thinking that the poser of the question says, for example, of Nika Autor's Newsreel 62, Worker and Family, which poses a 1966 exhibition of international art in Sloven Gradec as systematically marginalizing the contributions from the global South by placing them in the corners of the hall and reciprocally centering contributions from the USA and Western Europe. Do you see exhibitions like these as themselves marginal, or do they contextualize the trajectory you trace as one of many? Also wondering how close readings of exhibition design might complicate assessments of quote unquote participation.
Yeah, I've heard this before, this criticism. And I know the Sloven Gradec exhibition quite well, and I actually had a few slides from that show, and I took them off because there was just too much to show. I would say, first of all, Sloven Gradec is a town of 4,000 people. Secondly, it was the gallery in Sloven Gradec that was built by local participation. So people basically build their own gallery. Yes, the first exhibition was quite all over the place. And there was a lot of different kind of work, but the fact that they showed, you know, Cuban, a lot of Cuban artwork is important. No, there is no exhibition that is, you know, perfect in its framing. What I would say is that Sloven Gradec is only one example of many. I've heard a similar thing about Ljubljana Biennale, but when we, again, I come back to representation. I come back to the question of, over the 40 years that Yugoslavia participated in these cultural exchanges, what do we see? And we see a lot of different kinds of exhibitions that were organized. Yes, the exhibition design, I mean, they were of different sorts. We can think about, for example, New Tendencies, which was much more, sort of Western centric exhibition that was using a lot of the conceptual and kind of modern techniques of exhibiting. What changed with Ljubljana Biennale, for example, is the more budget, more investment in the exhibitions over the years, and a change in the representation. So again, like in every exhibition, like in every country, there are different approaches to this. I don't think it changes. The Sloven Gradec example changes the overall trajectory that I'm talking about of the collaboration. And also, I'm kind of interested to think about, does the very kind of clean and modernist approach to exhibition design is that maybe challenged through the kinds of more bottom up, if you will, grassroots organization of exhibitions that we see in Sloven Gradec challenges that. I would say that yes, right? So there's different ways that we can approach the politics of exhibiting. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you, Bojana. Maybe I can ask a question here, because it a little bit follows from the overall sentiment of the previous question. It's not really a question about art, but I wonder if you have thought about ways in which colonial liberation struggles and investment in such politics, what the kind of reciprocal move with respect to Yugoslavia's internal politics would yield. I'm thinking primarily of the fact that of the question of Kosovo and the status of Kosovo in Yugoslavia, in the socialist Yugoslavia, where arguably, not arguably, but actually colonialist practices were very much at work as well.
So one does not exclude the other or extricate the other. So, we can think about Ethiopia's case as well, which was itself involved in a colonial internal or quasi-internal relationship to its own territorial borders and other examples. So yes, but at the same time, I want to come back to the other question, which is in terms of art in particular, which is that after World War II, some of the members, some of the republics or areas in Yugoslavia had no cultural infrastructure, right? So for example, Bosnia had something like few galleries and very small amount of artists. Kosovo is the same. Slovenia actually didn't have our art academy. And so what we see after the war is investment in culture, so that there is a movement forward. I'm not denying that, 1980s have brought in a whole bunch of problematic political relationships, but I'm also interested in the ways in which you go from like 1945 in a country that's completely destroyed, with no support for artists because there was no money, where artists were literally begging for some money for paints, to having, cultural centers and exhibition spaces and things like that. So there's that. And then, of course, there is the problematic history of internal, as you say, colonization that cannot be denied, but it does not negate the overall project that socialism was moving towards. So that I guess that it exists within this tension or dialectic.
Right. No, of course, no, it doesn't deny the overall project. I just think it's very interesting precisely along those lines, because you have spent quite some time working on the art of the Yugoslav Revolution, which itself is articulating a variety of goals, objectives, ideas, political, aesthetic, and otherwise, which themselves are in a certain sense then through the history of the actual Yugoslav state, not always sufficiently lived up to. Here's another question. Again, congratulations. Thank you for such a nice presentation, Bojana. Could you say a few words about the possible influences of non-Western art on Yugoslav politically engaged art? Also, how do the new art practices fit into the corpus of non-aligned modernism, if at all?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's an important question, and this is the new work that I'm working on right now. So the book was really about establishing kind of a base, right, to think about what is there and what hasn't been written about. Now what I'm doing in my new research project is doing a comparative study, so that I'm actually looking at the influence of non-Western art into Yugoslavian art, or at least, if not direct influence, but direct echoes. So for example, one of the Macedonian artists who started his career before World War II and continued into the 20th century was influenced by Mexican muralism, even though at some point in his life he rejected it, but he was actually deeply influenced by Mexican muralism and ended up doing a large-scale mural in Mexico City in 1985. His name is Borcolozewski. And so his work is directly related to the work of Siqueiros and others who were sort of politically engaged. So he's an interesting example of how these sort of political aesthetic negotiations were done. There were others. So for example, when I'm reading Miroslav Krleža, I can hear some echoes of what was happening in India in 1930s, and how, Indian Association of Writers was thinking very similarly, in a similar way, about modernism and art in India at the time. So this is exactly what I'm trying to do right now, is to find these correspondences, if any. In terms of new art practices, and this is one of the things that I really talk about in the book, is that one of the important points about non-aligned modernism is that it wasn't only an aesthetic thing. I keep coming back to the influence of non-aligned modernism as an infrastructural thing. So as a kind of an investment into non-aligned collaboration, galleries, republics were given a lot of money for investment in exchange, in a cultural exchange. That investment influenced and created and spurred other cultural work and new art practices, even though it doesn't fit the kind of political and aesthetic ethos that I'm talking about, actually benefits from the non-aligned infrastructure building, because the state invests in these large sort of international exchanges. So and other galleries and other places. So even those, what we might call non-official, anti-state, kind of art practices that were outside of the mainstream are still benefiting through that infrastructure investment.
Thank you, Bojana. Here's another interesting question, actually from one of MA students in Greece, and it picks up on an aspect of your talk. To sum it up, the question is, or to shorten it, would you say that socialist realism and modernism coexist in the region and possibly interpenetrate each other, or rather that the term socialist realism is itself a misnomer which arose from the Western gaze that focused on differences rather than on kinship? In other words, that we can perceive socialist realism in Yugoslavia within larger continuity of European modernism.
So this is something that I'm thinking about right now. This is exactly the point that I'm thinking about now. I would say that socialist realism is maybe controversially, a form of modernism that was rejected by, by the Europeans. However, we know that in the 20s, there was a very heated debate around this, right, about being socialist realists and modernists, not just in Yugoslavia, but across the world. So these are all, very interesting questions. I would say that the question of socialist realism is much more complicated than what has been presented up to now. And I think it was made complicated after 1989 in a series of books that have come out that have mystified socialist realism, that have made it into something that it is not. And I'm referring to that Western gaze that you have referred to in your question. What I'm trying to do in the book and now in the work that I'm doing is wrestle with this very question. How do we read socialist modernism outside of these kind of imposed aesthetic and political trajectories, and how do we think of it as a more complicated term?
Interesting indeed, and I guess one could also add or take into account the fact that one can speak about the plurality of socialist realisms.
Absolutely.
And that within different countries of the Eastern Bloc especially, it fulfilled not always the same function, same motivation, same kind of materialist, had different materials groundings, just like what is often construed as some of the highest achievements of modernism from the West, we know in the context of Cold War themselves very much played a very specific political role. Exactly. Of kind of automatically connoting Western democratic liberties, etc.
Exactly. And when we think about socialist realism outside of the Eastern European context, right? When we move to Africa or Latin America, things become even more complicated and interesting.
Here's another question. Hello, congratulations for fabulous presentation. Yugoslavia had excellent artists. They would have deserved to be better known in the world. Why do you think they're not so well known? Was it for political reasons or because the West has always been too self-centered and patronizing towards countries like Yugoslavia and not interested?
Well, I guess, and we can see this, glean this from, internal negotiations by Yugoslavs trying to, place Yugoslav art elsewhere. There's a lot of what, in Black studies is called politics of respectability, right? Like, how do you present us? Because we've always known as backwater, right? This term backwater has been mentioned quite a bit in the kind of archival documents that I've found. And so Yugoslavs were very keenly aware of how Yugoslavia was perceived as a periphery. And so we're continuously fighting against this, both in terms of like representation in the Western context, but also through the work of non-aligned collaboration to sort of diverge representation from that. And, the fact that Yugoslavia participated in the non-aligned agency, news agency, NANAP, and started it within Tanjug was an important form of that, how to change these representations of views. Secondly, after 1989, of course, this becomes a political issue. And the reason why Yugoslav artists are not seen is because both internally, Yugoslavia, or what used to be Yugoslavia, and the narrative around art turned towards placing it within the Western canon. And because, of course, all of this question around socialism was rejected, violently rejected. And so it took us 30 years now to start thinking about, 20 years to start thinking about socialism and this kind of art in different terms, in more emancipatory terms and in the terms that they were seen before. So I would say it's a kind of a double thing for sure.
Thank you. And I think we maybe have time for just one more question before we wrap up. There are more in the chat. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get to them all, but another thank you for a fascinating presentation. You gave your book the title Non-Aligned Modernism, and the idea of non-alignment was obviously prominent in your talk. You also care about pre-1945 history and influences that actually have nothing to do with the Cold War. Were you at all worried that giving the idea of non-alignment so much prominence in your work, that the Cold War becomes too important of a framework for the international cooperation and connections you describe, even if it is a prominence arising out of the negation of Cold War dynamics? Or did you ultimately conclude that the Cold War or its negation was constitutive of the story that you're telling, and therefore referencing it is crucial? Do you care about the idea of non-alignment as analytical tool, or do you care about it because it informed the thinking of the artists you write about?
So this is a broad question, but complicated question. But let me say this. In my initial, when I started this thinking about non-aligned, which was in my PhD studies many, many years ago, I'm afraid to say when I started thinking about this, I saw it in a kind of, Cold War thing. But the more and this is one of the criticisms about Yugoslavia is like, oh, Yugoslavia started the non-aligned because it had to, because it was expelled from the Soviet influence, and it had to do it. But I was asking myself the question, okay, where did these ideas come from? Like, how did they even come up with this notion that, let's look beyond the East or West? And when I was trying to understand this, what I saw is that Yugoslav socialism, the histories of socialism in Yugoslavia had this anti-imperial idea already, because Yugoslavia, and this is maybe what's also controversial, or what some people see as controversial in my work, is that I claim that Yugoslavia is also colonized place, right? It was a colonized place through Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Turkish Empire, or Ottoman Empire, and many others. So that these ideas were already there in the ether, if you will, before World War II. And in order for me to prove that, I had to go into this area of World War II. And already there, we see this idea of Yugoslavian people sort of in between, right? This kind of in-betweenness that is embedded in non-aligned is something that they were already thinking about. So it is also kind of thinking about trajectory, larger trajectories of ideas and larger trajectories of socialism, that they didn't just happen after 1948. In terms of, do I care about it as an analytical tool or something? It's both. I'm interested in as an analytical tool, but also something that influenced artists and policymakers. People didn't just decide to do this and to invest so much money and work into this. There was not just artists, these were politicians, ambassadors, cultural workers, ministers, like the whole country was involved in this, right? So there was a huge amount of investment done, and it wasn't for nothing. So it's both an analytical tool, but also something that informed these larger structures, even for artists who didn't care for it. But as I said, through the infrastructure of the art world and investment in the art world, they benefited from it.
Thank you, Bojana. Wonderful way to conclude, I think. And on behalf of Chris and also on behalf of the audience, and we've had quite a nice size group of virtual attendees, I want to thank you for your talk.
Thank you so much, Pavle, for everything and for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, for being here and listening to my ramblings.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.